The following message is a presentation of Legonier Ministries, home of the radio program Renewing Your Mind with R.C. Sproul.
I remember when I was a seminary student that I was completely awed by one of my professors, Dr. Gerstner. He was awe-inspiring in several ways, not the least of which was his encyclopedic knowledge of theology and philosophy and the acute mind that he brought to bear in the classroom. But also, I admired him greatly for his profound spiritual depth and godliness. And of course, Dr. Gerstner was a devotee of Jonathan Edwards and surely the world's greatest expert on the thought and theology of Jonathan Edwards. And one of the things I think that is not so well known about Edwards was that Edwards wrote frequently about the reality of heaven. So often the caricature that we have in our mind about Jonathan Edwards was that he was preoccupied with hell. But he wrote so much more about heaven than he ever did about hell and gave tremendous insights into it. And so what I remember from seminary is that one day, after Dr. Gerstner had given a provocative lecture, I went up to him after class, and I said, Dr. Gerstner, could I ask you a question? And he said, yes, of course. And I said, what's heaven like? And he gave me this strange look like, how am I supposed to know? I haven't been there. Well, he gave me some things to read, but I really did expect to get almost an eyewitness report from the man. So impressed was I about his spiritual depth and understanding. But what a question, huh? What is heaven like? Is there anyone who hasn't raised that question at one time or another? I mean, the previous question is there really such a thing as heaven? Christianity's been criticized roundly in modern times for being a so-called pie-in-the-sky religion. We remember the critique that Karl Marx made against Christianity, where, although he didn't invent this concept, he popularized the idea that religion is the opiate of the masses. And of course, Marx's thesis was that religion was invented and used by the ruling classes to exploit and oppress the poor people of the world and keep them from revolting by promising them pie in the sky if they would be good little slaves now, and if they would obey their masters and do their jobs and accept low wages and so on, that their reward would be deferred into eternity. And in the meantime, these ruthless exploiters of the poor were amassing fortunes for themselves here on earth. And so Marx took the cynical view that religion, with its hope of heaven, has been used as a club to keep unthinking people in line. And there's been a reaction against that almost universally, so that now we're seen as being less than sophisticated if we think at all in terms of a future life, except when we're in a funeral home or at a graveside. But one cannot take Christianity seriously without seeing the central importance of the concept of heaven. There really is a pie-in-the-sky idea that is integral to the Bible, and especially to the New Testament. And I'm afraid we've lost our appetite for, or our taste sensitivity towards, those delights that God has stored up for His people in the future. I'd like to begin our brief study of heaven by turning your attention to the 14th chapter of the Gospel according to St. John. Some of you are aware that they have taken polls periodically asking Christian people to name their favorite chapter in the New Testament. Whenever I see polls like that, there's always one of two chapters that comes in first and the other one comes in second. And those two chapters that vie for the greatest popularity in the New Testament include chapter 13 of 1 Corinthians, the great love chapter, and chapter 14 of the Gospel of John. And it's that chapter that we're going to look at now. John chapter 14 begins with these words from Jesus. Know that Jesus is speaking to his disciples in his last really great discourse with them in the upper room on the night of the Lord's Supper, the Last Supper, and the night in which he was betrayed, and the night before his execution. And he says in chapter 14, verse 1, "Let not your heart be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you." Now, Jesus begins this part of the discourse with an admonition, with an imperative to his disciples, saying, do not allow your hearts to be distressed or disturbed. This is a call to trust and to faith. And he goes on to reason with them in a succinct manner, but in a profound manner. And these words, of course, are so comforting to us that sometimes we can gloss over the cogency of the argument that is contained in this brief little exercise in reason. Jesus says, let not your hearts be troubled, and then he makes an assertion about the disciples. He says, you believe in God. He doesn't ask them, do you believe in God? He knows that they believe in God, and he says, that's the first premise. You believe in God. And now he goes on to say, believe also in me. Now this is central to the testimony of the New Testament, namely that it is God who certifies and verifies the identity of Jesus. It is God who proves, through endowing Christ with the miraculous power that he has, and who raises him to certify that this is his beloved Son. 3 times in the New Testament, it is recorded that God spoke audibly from heaven. And in all 3 occasions, the announcement that came audibly from heaven was substantially the same thing. This is my beloved Son. In one case, the voice says, in whom I'm well pleased. Another time it says, hear him. And so Jesus is saying that God the Father sent him into the world. God the Father bears witness to his identity in the world. And now, the night before he is killed, Jesus says to his disciples, all right, you believe in God, and believe in me. Now, it's in this context that Jesus makes the statements that he makes about heaven. Before he makes his announcement about heaven, he speaks of faith in God and faith in himself. Now, why does he start with this premise, you believe in God? Well, there's a real sense, beloved, in which that proposition is the controlling idea for one's whole understanding of life, of the world, of death, and of heaven. If there is no God, there is no reason to have any significant hope for the continuity of personal existence that we call life. And yet, if God exists, what would be more ridiculous than to assume that he creates creatures in his own image that are destined ultimately for annihilation? to fall into the abyss of non-existence, to live as grass for a season, only to perish with all of our memories, all of our hopes, all of our labor, ending in meaninglessness. We remember the line from Shakespeare about the poor player that struts his hour upon the stage, referring, of course, to the life of the actor, the dramatist. He struts his hour upon the stage and then is heard no more. And what's the assessment? It's a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. And what an image that we get from that statement. The image of the person who is in the limelight, in the spotlight, for a brief interlude of their life. And then suddenly, silence. And the sentiment of this idea is, if that is the final conclusion to human existence, then the story of life is the idiot's tale. An idiot is someone who is irrational. An idiot is someone who doesn't make sense. An idiot is on the rim of madness. And the tales that he tells are not credible stories. They may be filled with sound and fury, with noise and passion. They may be loud, they may be moving, but they signify what? Nothing. I think that's the great existential question that every human being faces when that person faces death. I recently celebrated the 30th birthday of my son. And I'll never forget the day that my son arrived. And to stand in the ward there in the hospital where they have the infant children, and you look down at your firstborn son, and you see a new life that has come into your life, and it changes your life automatically. All relationships will now be different forever. And I remember that occasion vividly, because when I went home and then came back to the hospital, I had to stop at this business office where my mother worked to pick her up, to take her to see her grandson that evening. And so I picked her up after work, went back to the hospital, and my mother went in and she saw her grandson. And she was absolutely ecstatic about it. We got home about 9 o'clock, and she said as we walked into the living room, "This is the happiest day of my life." And she said, "I'm tired, I'm going to bed." And so I said good night. She went into her bedroom and went to bed. The next morning, I heard my daughter yelling, and my daughter's yelling awakened me. And I could tell that she was yelling at my mother. And she came into my room and she said, "Grandma won't wake up." So I said, "Well, leave her alone. I'll see how she's doing." And I walked in. And as soon as I walked in the room, I realized that my mother was dead, that she had died in her sleep. And I walked over and touched her. And her body was cold. And rigor mortis had already set in. And it was one of those weird, uncanny moments of human experience. I stood there by her bed. And you know how it is when you go to sleep and then you wake up the next morning, you have no sense of the passing of time. Even though it may have been 8 hours or 6 hours or whatever it was in the interim, it seems like a matter of seconds or moments. You fall asleep, you wake up. Well, it just seemed to me that just moments before, I had heard my mother say to me, "This is the happiest day of my life. Tell me good night." She was a living, breathing, caring, passionate, live human being. And now I'm standing by her bed, and she is lifeless. It was so weird, particularly in light of the contrast, whereas the previous morning, I had seen the newness of life with the birth of my son, and virtually on the same day, my mother died. And so I had this experience of this conflict between life and death. And as I stood there, I said, this doesn't make sense. Death doesn't make sense. And every fiber in my being said to me, this cannot be the final conclusion for human experience. Now, that could all be explained by an emotional need in my soul and in your soul to believe that life is meaningful. But I was thinking in these terms, if God exists, this cannot be the end. And that's what Jesus is saying to his disciples when he says, let not your heart be troubled. See, when I stood beside my mother in that room, my heart was troubled, deeply troubled. And Jesus says, don't allow that. Let not your heart be troubled. If you believe in God, believe also in me. And immediately upon making this connection between faith in the Father and faith in him, he says, in my Father's house are many mansions, and if it were not so, I would have told you. Do you hear what Jesus is saying here to his disciples? As he approaches the moment of his death, he says to them, trust me. Trust the Father. That my Father has a mansion, huge house, with many mansions indeed. And he says, if this were not so, if this were just fantasy, if this were just emotional wish projection, if this were fairy tales or human superstition or whistling in the dark, I would have told you that. Keep in mind that if Jesus Christ is God incarnate, he's the greatest theologian that ever walked the planet. He doesn't make theological mistakes, nor does he approve of theological error. He was not going to allow his disciples to go through the rest of their lives holding to a belief that was false. He says your hope for life after death is not groundless. It is not a false hope. If it were a false hope, I would have told you. I would have corrected it. And I go to prepare a place for you. And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you to myself, that where I am, there you may be also. Jesus said, I'm going home. I'm going to my Father's house. I'm going to receive my final inheritance. But I'm not going to heaven alone. I am going there to prepare a place for you, so that where I am, you may be also. Now, everybody, Christian or not, longs for a reunion with their loved ones that have gone on before them. But the Christian longs to be with Christ. I can't wait to see my father, my mother, my friends who have died in heaven. But beyond that, the ultimate hope of my soul is to see the resurrected Christ in his Father's house. And he promised that that would be. How often have you wondered about whether there was life after death? Sometimes we shrink in terror and in doubt whenever we contemplate something as wonderful as heaven purports to be. We sometimes are assaulted by the idea that's just too good to be true. A couple of years ago, my wife and I were involved in a train accident in Alabama, where more people were killed in that train wreck than in all the rest of the accidents of Amtrak in their history combined. And when we survived that, we had newspaper reporters poking microphones in our faces and asking questions like, why were you so lucky as to survive this? And why would God allow you to survive and while he took these other people's lives? And I've often thought about that, and one of the things that pops into my mind is the assumption behind that question, that I was the lucky one. Because had I not survived the train wreck, I'd be home. I would be in heaven. What's the big deal? But we naturally assume that we'll cling to life in this world desperately, fearful that what lies beyond is worse. But for those who are going to heaven, the bliss that God has stored up for you is unworthy to be compared with any joy or any delight we cling to in this life.
For more information about Legonier Ministries, call 1-800-435-4343 or contact us on the web at ligonier.org. That's ligonier.org. Or write P.O. Box 54 7500, Orlando, Florida 32854.